Hi guys, welcome to the Classicist Corner. I'm Kat, and this week I'm going to be talking about heroic generations in ancient Greek myth. So if you're interested in ancient mythology, you've probably read about heroes such as Perseus, Theseus, Heracles, Jason, Achilles, Odysseus, etc. And if you're interested in these stories, there might be some assumptions that I would potentially like to correct. For example, the assumption that these stories are separate entities. These stories might exist in a Greek setting, but they aren't interconnected and they don't really apply to each other. Or the assumption that ancient writers were able to just create these myths, that they'd be able to sort of do what they want with them. While sticking to some certain points, such as Theseus and the Minotaur, they would be able to have full creative control on what these characters did if they were, say, rewriting these myths or doing what they wanted with them. And these assumptions would be wrong, if you've made these assumptions at all. Greek mythology was actually very long and very complicated and, most importantly, very interconnected, with very specific points of time and notions of heroic generations. While there were loads of heroes that did come from certain family trees, like loads of heroes descended from Zeus, they were actually all somewhat descended from each other. For example, you couldn't really have, say you were writing an ancient play, you couldn't have Perseus and Theseus and Heracles all turn up together because Theseus and Heracles were actually descended from Perseus. So he was their great-great-great-granddad, something further back than that. So you wouldn't have these sort of characters being able to interact because they're a good couple of generations separate from each other. That's not to say Theseus and Heracles were separate from each other. Actually, they existed in the same heroic generation. And that's also another point, is that some of these heroes interacted with each other. For example, Heracles was actually an Argonaut with Jason, and then it's actually Jason's wife, Medea, that went on to be Theseus' stepmother. So they are kind of all interconnected, and you get these weird family trees. Actually, the best way to describe it would be if you went to Google, say, Lord of the Rings family trees or Game of Thrones family trees, and you'll get these long, complicated, fictional family trees. Ancient mythology works a bit like that. You have these long family trees and you get these connections, and there is a very strong element of time. For example, another element of this would be the hero Cadmus, who existed in the same heroic generation as Perseus. Some of his descendants actually go on to mother the god Dionysus. So Perseus would exist in a time before Cadmus would exist in a time before Dionysus the god. So it's not even just the heroes that exist in a timeline, it's the gods too, which I found really interesting. And so also these heroes, such as Theseus and Heracles, they exist in a couple of generations before the Trojan War, before the heroes at Troy. So you can't just say all the heroes and then slap them together in all sort of this one conglomerate group. They all exist in different times. And ancient Greek authors and writers had to be quite clear about this. They had to keep this in mind quite clearly, because while we might say, oh, they're just myths, they're just fictional, an ancient audience and an ancient writer would take it in a different way. These stories really matter to them in a way that doesn't really apply to us. For example, these stories were their history, they were their religion, they were part of their cultural identity as Greeks. So to them they were quite important, and they would have known these stories and these generations of heroes very, very well. And that's not to say that they took them seriously. 100% of the time they didn't really at all. I mean, if you look at the ancient comedies, for example, they do take the mick quite a lot, but they still had these sort of clear canonical rules in mind of what could happen with these myths. And, characters did change and they did certain things with them, and there are different versions of different myths depending on the city or depending on the context. For example, one city's Heracles is going to be very different from another city's Heracles because of different reasons. And so the differences in these myths and the sort of continuation of these generations of mythology can be seen in Greek literature very early on. For example, Hesiod's Theogony Theogony is a origin of the gods, so it does tell of the original generations of the gods, so the Titans and Gaia and Ouranos, and then the Titans, and then the gods, and then etc. But it also follows heroic generations because it says that so such and such god fathered this hero who fathered this hero, etc. And it does talk about some of the more important myths, like Jason turns up, Theseus turns up, Odysseus turns up, that sort of thing. Then you sort of get the Homeric hymns, and I say Homeric because we don't actually know who wrote them, and where their linguistic style is very similar to the epic poems, so they just got the label Homer slapped on them, even though it probably wasn't Homer. So the Homeric myths also hymns, I don't know why I keep saying myth, the Homeric hymns do talk about the origins of gods again, and then any particular important descendants of those gods gets a mention, so you get these clear elements of generation. Homer himself is actually really good at setting out these sort of Homeric generations, especially with the character of Nestor. And Nestor is a very old man on the Greek side of the war, and he is basically an advisor and a councilman to all of the various Greek heroes involved in the conflict. And he's basically the ultimate back in my day guy, because he has seen 3 generations live to adulthood, 3 generations born and then die. So he is very, 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 very old. And he likes to compare the current generations of heroes at Troy quite unfavourably to his generation of heroes when he was a young man. And a particular story he tells, which is quite interesting, is the tale of the Caledonian boar when he went on his hunt with various heroes. And this is quite an important thing in general mythology. And Theseus actually was on that hunt as well, so that puts Theseus very far back from the heroes at Troy. So from that you do get this strong feeling of heroic generations even from early Greek literature, and that's carried on to later Greek literature such as the tragedies at Athens, the Hellenic epics way later on, and even in Roman epics the Romans still kept this idea of heroic genealogy and history going on. So if you're interested in knowing more about this, yeah, check out those literature, check out the plays, check out the epic poems, and sort of keep the idea of these generations in mind. Also another good text, and this is actually Roman, but it deals with a lot of ancient Greek myths, which is Ovid's Metamorphoses, and that kind of starts in a chronological basis, and it does talk about generations and who fathered who, and heroes that were descended from other heroes. So check those texts out if you're interested. If you would like to ask me any more questions about how I interpret these heroic generations, just give me a message in the comments or on my Tumblr, and yeah, I will see you guys next week with a different topic on classics. So okay, bye guys, see you soon.